Hi, so I'm going to be answering audience questions and also drinking tea. What is the biggest challenge you faced in your transition from writing YA books to adult books? I think that a little bit of what I was sort of talking about before in terms of writing characters who had a very different point in their lives than teenage characters that I'm used to writing. So I had to really sort of think about the reactions that they would have, their relationships, I mean, especially relationships with parents, because relationships with parents remain important throughout your life, but they really change a lot from the point in which you are sort of dependent on them and you require them to the point where you are more of a peer with your parents and you're also starting to realize, that they are flawed human beings. So I feel like, kind of getting into the headspace of these characters who were just in a very different time of life than the characters that I'm used to writing. They're also just a lot more restrained. I mean, teenagers feel everything very strong. I mean, I did anyway, feel everything very strongly and everything, kind of bubbles up to the surface. And these characters have truly learned to tamp their emotions down. So kind of getting at what they were really feeling through their layers of sort of defense was definitely a challenge. If you had the choice to live in Idris prior to the end of Queen of Air and Darkness, or Castellane, which would you choose? I like that qualifier since, of course, nobody wants to live in Idris after the end of Queen of Air and Darkness. I think I would pick Castellane just because I love Idris, but I think that it's not really designed to be a place that you necessarily want to live full time. Most Shadowhunters live outside of Idris and they come there. They have country houses there. They have their vacation houses there. But Castellane has a whole complicated, layered, society that's, been there for thousands of years, and it has a seedy side and it has a complicated governmental side and it has all sorts of entertainment and, I mean, the parties of Castellane, definitely legendary. So I feel like I would be there for that. When did you realize your ideas for Swordcatcher were strong enough to become its own series, not bits and pieces that could be incorporated into the Shadowhunters universe? That's an interesting question. I mean, I think sometimes we have sort of free-floating ideas that could go into a number of different books, but I mean, the idea for Castellane came so very much out of the idea of creating this world, and that world wasn't compatible with the Shadowhunter world. It was very much, significant that it was a secondary world and that it was a high fantasy world, and it has this whole history of how magic works in that world. There was once a time where everybody had magic in the land of Danamore, which is where Castellane is. And these incredibly powerful sorcerer kings arose, and they had these massive battles, and they nearly destroyed the world, and they eventually were wiped out, and most magic was wiped out along with them. And that sort of forms the backbone of the history of Castellane and the reasons why people feel the way they do about magic and what everyone kind of does there. And I don't feel like there would have been a way to incorporate that into the Shadowhunters world, which a very significant part of the Shadowhunters world is that it's in our world. It exists within and inside and alongside our world. So yeah, I think, really from the beginning, I knew it was a separate world. Which real places worked as inspiration for the Swordcatcher world? So I already talked about Venice, and there's a really great book called City of Fortune that I read. It's sort of about the history of Venice and the swashbuckling and the infighting and the poisoning and the murdering is all in there. So I used a lot of sort of the structure of how Venice worked because, so a lot of times when people talk about world building, they say geography is destiny. Castellane sits in the curve of a bunch of mountains on a bunch of salt flats. It's got the ocean on one side and the mountains on the other. There's no place you could grow crops or have animals or do any kind of husbandry or grow anything. So if you are to survive as a city, what are you going to do in order to make money and have an economy? Trade. And that was the same situation with Venice. You've seen Venice, it's on top of a lagoon. You can't grow anything, in order to survive, they had to invest heavily in trade. And so That, came to me early as part of my research into the Silk Roads. And so I was sort of like, well, I'm going to use, some of this idea that when you're, located in a place like this, you have to have this very trade-focused economy. And because you do, that drives all the politics, and it drives the money in the city, and the money drives the power and drives the crime and drives the smuggling and all of that. So Venice, then also Istanbul, which also was, a major maritime power, and the southwest of France, which I was really interested in because after the Jews were expelled from Spain, a lot of them moved into southwestern France. So I had been traveling around southwestern France with my husband, and we had found all of this sort of Jewish life that was sort of wound into the tapestry of the culture of southwestern France in a way that I wasn't really expecting. And so I feel like that sort of mixture of French culture and of these Jews who had come and created their own, societies there is very much a part of the background of Castellane. Let's see. What's your favorite quote from the book? I think it's Kell says, "I am the prince's shield, and a shield must be iron." And I always liked that quote because it's both true in the sense that he has to be strong like iron, but also that he has to be unfeeling. He has to sort of push his own feelings to the side and be sort of almost an object that stands between Conor and the rest of the world. He's not allowed to have his own feelings or wants or needs or desires. And I feel like that really encapsulates a lot about his job and his relationship to Conor, and also his relationship to who he wants to be. What is your Roman Empire? If this doesn't make sense, ignore it, but my Roman Empire is the Shadowhunter books. Okay, I don't totally know what that means. I guess I would say that this is probably not the right answer to the question, but I've always been fascinated by the Roman Empire, and there is the basis of Castellane and its history is that there was once a analog to the Roman Empire, and Castellane was part of it, and so there's a lot of you can see that Castellane is a modern city that's built on the ruins of a crumbling empire, and I always love the crumbling empire trope in books. Okay. What was your favorite part of designing a new fantasy world? I think all the little details were really fun. Because you do have the freedom to kind of choose to do whatever you want. It doesn't have to fit in or around the edges of our world. So creating the markets in Castellane, the kind of clothes that people wear and what the meanings of the clothes are, the food that they eat, the parties that they have, all the little pieces of custom, all of that was just really, it was fun for me. It's the stuff I love in fantasy books that I read, is all those very specific details that build a world. So coming up with them myself was really delightful. What are you most excited about this book when people read it? I want to know people's predictions. The book has a lot of mystery in it. Those mysteries, I have to tell you, are not wrapped up in this book because there is another book coming. So I want to know what everyone thinks is happening. There's a big crime that's committed. I want to know, who people think did it. I want to know who people think the romances are going to be, because there's romance in the book, but I don't think it's as clear cut as we often find in books. I don't think you can predict exactly who's going to wind up with who. So I just want to hear all the fan theories about, no matter how outlandish, about, what's secretly going on with the king and all of that. And I'm curious. What has been your favorite book to write and why? Like ever in the history of writing? I don't know. I would probably have to say City of Bones because it was the first book I wrote. And it was a long time ago, I think, as we've covered. But I think writing your first book is always a really unique experience. And it's the first time you're writing a book without any idea of whether or not you can write a book or whether or not you can finish a book. And so there is this real sense of sort of amazement when you do finish it. that, however much you enjoy all the books that you write afterwards, you're never going to have that exact thing again. Though I know it's only the first book, how many books do you hope to write in this world, if you are allowed to answer that? I don't know if I'm allowed to answer it. So we definitely have 2 books in this world, and I'd like for there to be more books than that. I was thinking probably ideally around 4. It's a lot of world. It's got a lot of corners to it. It's got a lot of stories that can be told in the world of Castellane. So I would definitely be excited to keep writing in this world. What are some of your favorite fantasy authors to read? And then it has a little parentheses and it says, besides Holly, which I think, that's very cruel to Holly. I'm not allowed to recommend her. Okay, so some of my favorite authors, Samantha Shannon, M.K. Jemisin, sorry if I mispronounced that, Lee Bardugo, George R. R. Martin, his books are right over there. Let's see what else. I'm terrible at answering questions like this. I always blank out. And then I think I love a lot of sort of classic books that I grew up reading. So I'll just name check a few of them. I mean, obviously, The Lord of the Rings, the Narnia Chronicles, even though I have some issues with how it ended, and The Dark is Rising, the Chronicles of Prydain. So I would definitely recommend all of those if you haven't read them. In what ways do you feel you've grown as an author since you started publishing in 2007? I'd like to think one of the great things about having a career as an author is that you're always getting better. You're learning more. Like, there's never a time where I feel like you're like, okay, I've learned all of it. I know everything about writing and I don't need to learn anymore. So I would like to think, that I've kept on growing and improving. And I've certainly learned how to write different kinds of characters. Then I started out knowing how to write. I've learned how to write sort of different perspectives, different point of views, how to create a mystery, how to, kind of hide clues in the books that will later pay off. And one of the things I love about other people's books is when they're sort of buried, little like hints. And only when you kind of go back on a second reading do you see like, oh, all of these are leading up to this one thing. And that's something I had to learn to do over time. Most inspiring location for this novel, and will you likely return for inspiration? Let's see. There's a lot of places that have inspired different countries in the novel, and partly because of COVID, I wasn't able to go to all of them. So there are analogs to Hungary, to Zanzibar, and I've never been to either of those places, and I really want to go. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to go and do research while I'm there. And then again, and I've also really never been to Istanbul, so I'd like to go and go there, sort of visit, with an eye towards examining sort of its history as part of the Silk Road. Ironically, my mother, who is 80 years old, is currently on a tour of the Silk Road with a bunch of other 80-year-old people and keeps sending me pictures of her in Bukhara and Samarkand and Tashkent. And I'm like, why am I not on this trip? Which technically probably because it's an elder hostel trip and they wouldn't let me go. But I feel like, that is the trip that I should be taking. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to, at some point, go on a Silk Road tour and visit the caravanserai and whatnot. And I became very fascinated when I was researching this book in the history of the Jewish traders of the Silk Road. They were called Rodanites. And and they now do, very recently, they do sort of Jewish tours of the Silk Road and the influence of Jewish merchants and whatnot. And that's something that I would really like to do. So hopefully, fingers crossed, I will get to do that. If you could compare the 2 main characters to a drink, what would they be? Any beverage. Oh my gosh. Man, this is the kind of thing that takes me forever. Okay, Lynn would be, I think, a cold cup of black coffee. She is always running around. She is always busy. She is always running around seeing her patients. She never has time for anything. So I feel like she is the person who is drinking the coffee to keep her going, even though it's gone cold a long time ago. And Kel is, what's a complicated drink? Let's think. I don't know. All right, Kel is a pumpkin spice latte. If the you that just started writing could see yourself now, what would that past you be most surprised by? I think the past me would be surprised that I have a career writing. I don't think I ever expected that that would happen. I think that I thought that, I would write, but I would have a day job and writing would be my secondary job and not my whole job. In fact, it was years before I quit my day job. I sold my first novel. I was working as a copy editor for tabloid magazines, and I stayed in that job, writing during the day and doing editing and copy editing at night until after City of Glass came out. And then finally I was like, okay, I can afford to quit. I'm going to quit, but it was still very scary. You feel like you're sort of jumping off into the unknown. And so I think that was what I would be. I think I would be surprised that that I was a writer and that I was just a writer and that I had been a writer for so long. Okay. Have you read any good books lately that you recommend? I would recommend Starling House by Alex Harrow. Really great book. And I just started The Hurricane Wars. It's good so far. If these characters had normal or real world jobs, what would they be? I mean, Lynn's easy. We have doctors in our world, so she would just be a doctor. Kel, there is not a lot of call for identical twin bodyguards in our actual real world. So I don't think that that's what he would be. But he is clever. He has a devious mind. I think he would be a spy. That's a real world job. You can really be a spy. He would be a spy. And also he's, very, very good at pretending to be other people. So I think he would be excellent at undercover. How does your planning structure work when you're mapping out how you want your story to unfold? I'm an obsessive outliner, so I've talked a little bit about that, but I'll write out the scenes, every scene in the book. Like I could tell you that there's 139 scenes in Swordcatcher. And, each scene I'll write, sort of what happens in that scene, little notes about which arc that scene advances or which mystery it addresses. And then I'll sort of put them all together so I can see them visually and read through them. And then if I need to, I'll move the scenes around because sometimes I feel like they're not in the right place. This scene needs to go over here. This other scene needs to go here. There's no explanation for this scene, so another scene needs to be added or deleted. So that's a very visual aspect of the planning, and then I'll transfer them into a Google Slides document so that I have them all there. And then once I have those, then I'll go through the scenes one by one and I'll expand them out, and then I'll actually start writing the whole thing. So it's quite a procedure. How long have you had the idea for this new book/world? I think 6 years. It's about 7 years that I've been thinking about it. And it was really just the first kind of a one idea, and the two stories were separate. I had an idea about Lynn and writing this sort of Jewish inflected mythology. And then I also had a completely separate idea about this guy who was a body double for a prince. And at some point I realized that they were the same story. And they were two different aspects of the city. There's a lot of discussion in Swordcatcher about how Castellane is sort of two different cities depending on who you are and where you live in the city. And there's two kings. There's the ragpicker king and there's the actual king in the palace. So everything has a sort of mirror version of itself. And you can even see that on the cover. The top part of the cover is the palace and the bottom part of the cover is the black mansion where the ragpicker king lives, and they sort of mirror each other. So I think I realized that the book was going to be a lot about mirroring, and that I could do some really interesting things with Kel as one kind of character and Lynn as a completely different kind of character who's seeing a different side to the city and experiencing a different kind of Castellane. How did the writing process for Swordcatcher differ from the writing process you used for your Shadowhunter books? P.S. I am a huge fan, Dana. Hi, Dana. Thank you for the question. I mean, I've talked a little bit about all the cards and the moving around the pieces and the Post-its and the slides. And that's not something I generally do for Shadowhunter books. Well, because I think I've been working on the Shadowhunters for so long, I have a sort of a massive catalog of all of the details of the world, family trees, how the magic works, weapons, characters, magic, history. And so I think I'm able to hold a lot more in my head where the Shadowhunters are concerned. But I still outline. I just don't outline scene by scene in the same way. I outline chapter by chapter. So it's more and also the Shadowhunter books tend to have multiple points of view. We were looking often at books with 6 or 7 different characters giving their points of view and having their arcs and their stories. In Swordcatcher, you just have the 2. So usually with Shadowhunters, what I'll do is break everything out into basically 7 different outlines, and each outline follows the one character who has a point of view. And then I'll try to connect, create the connections between the where everybody is at what time, and how they're all experiencing the same story. Whereas with Swordcatcher, it was very much about sort of advancing the plot by trading off between Kel and Lynn. So Kel, Lynn, like that. So it was definitely a different kind of structure. And I think also because there's only 2 points of view, which for me is less than I usually do, there's a lot of characters in the book, like Antonetta, like the Ragpicker King, like Connor, who have a lot of secrets and a lot of stuff going on. And we don't know what it is. We never get inside their heads. So we never see their points of view. And we see them solely from the outside. We see them from Lynn's point of view. We see them from Kel's point of view. And sometimes we'll see the same character from Lynn's point of view and Kel's point of view and realize that they see this one character very differently, and that there's some piece of characterization that's important in that dissonance. And I think that was definitely something that was very unique to Swordcatcher. How did you know it was time to make your debut in the adult fantasy world? I don't think I thought about it that way. I think I was interested in this story, and then as the story, it's sort of like with City of Bones, I didn't know I was writing YA. I just knew I was writing a fantasy book, and then the characters were teenagers. And as the book took shape and I showed it to people, they all said, oh, this is young adult. And then with this book, as I created it and as the characters sort of came to life, I realized there's no way that this can be a YA book. These characters are 25, and there's no way to make them not 25 because they need to be this age for the story to work the way that it does. And so I realized, well, this is an adult book, so I guess that's what I'm doing. I'm doing an adult book. Do you prefer writing beginnings, middles, or ends? And is it different for a single book versus for a series as a whole, i.e. writing the beginning, middle, end of a book versus the first, middle, last book of a series? Zoe. This is a very complicated question, Zoe. I like writing middles. Sort of like my favorite seasons of television shows are usually like season 2 and 3, because I get sad at the endings of things, and the beginnings of things are build up. And then once all that, which is enjoyable, but then once all that stuff is sort of in place, there's so much you can do to play around with it. So I really like the middles of things because that's where you raise the stakes of the story. That's where you know all the characters and you've gotten to know them. And so you're excited to see sort of what happens to them, and in various situations you have senses of how they're going to respond or why this particular situation would be a crisis for that character. And so let's see. Then in terms of writing, I do think that is different from writing sort of the whole series. Usually I have a general outline that covers the whole series, but the very specific outline is for one book. So I do like writing the middle of the series. I do like writing the middle of the book. But I think in terms of just generally enjoying it, I like the endings of books more than I like ending the series, because the end of the series, I always have to say goodbye to the characters, and that's always hard. Okay. Do you have a favorite scene from Swordcatcher or a part of research that you'd like to share with your readers? Oh, I'm trying to think of a way to address this that isn't spoilery. There are a couple of different scenes that I really love that were born out of historical research. There's one in which a character is supposed to be getting married, hasn't met the person that they're marrying, and the person shows up, and it is this incredible shock that was based on an actual historical event. So I can only, but I cannot, I feel, go into who is involved. So let me think of something where I can. I think for me, doing the research into Lynn's medical knowledge and her doctoring was actually really fun. And I didn't know that it would be. Fortunately, my best friend is a doctor, so I was able to pester her a lot. But there is a scene where Kell is injured. Lynn has to go to the palace to heal him. And what he has is what's known as a cardiac tamponade, not in the book, but in reality, which means there's blood in the sac around his heart. It's pressing on his heart. It's making it hard for him to, in his lungs, it's making it hard for him to breathe. And you know, this is the kind of thing in a medical drama like ER where everyone screams, chest tube, because the way that you fix this problem, you literally cut a hole in the side of the person's body and you shove a tube in there, and the tube goes into the area around your heart and the blood drains out. And so I had said to my, best friend, what is an injury that he could have that's threatening his life, but that you could reverse really quickly? And she said, cardiac tamponade. It's like magic. You stick the chest tube in and the person goes from dying to being perfectly fine. And then I had to do all of this research to find out whether this was something that you could ever actually do with the kind of tools that would be available to a doctor in sort of the Renaissance period, which is the historical period that's most analogous to Swordcatcher. And I discovered that there were physicians in ancient Rome who were using reeds to perform this procedure. So creating the scene where Lynn fixes, Kell's injuries by fixing his cardiac tamponade by using a sharpened reed was actually really fun and enjoyable for me. I hope it will be fun and suspenseful for other people as well, but I was just sort of amazed by how cool it was that this was something that people had been doing for so long. Okay, I think this is the last question that I'm going to be able to answer. But it's a good one. Do you have any advice for writing interesting romantic relationships between characters? I think that my advice would be to first think of the character relationship as a dynamic. Think like, what are the dynamics between people that I really like or find interesting? Think of examples of ones that really resonate with you, and then sort of drill down into that and think, was it about this that interests me so much? And I remember creating, I can't spoil any of the romantic relationships in Swordcatcher, so I'm sorry. But I remember in creating them, I was thinking, what are my favorite romantic stories? What is about those romances that appeals to me? Is it the idea that these people have known each other a long time but are just discovering secrets about each other that make them realize that the other person is a romantic interest for them where before they didn't? And how do I play around with that? Can I bring changes on it? Can I do something interesting about it? And I think for me, high tension romances are always really interesting. I like the stakes to be very high, the emotional stakes. So you have to think like, what is at stake for this character in this romantic relationship? Is it just, the romance and whether it'll work out or not? Or is there more? Like if they fall in love with this person, is there going to be a disaster? Are the consequences of this relationship, what are they going to affect? And think about it that way. Hopefully that helps. Know both your characters really well, know what they would do in any given in any given scene, and try to think about how those characteristics they have will affect and rub up against the other person's characteristics. And I think that's it. That's all I can do for right now. But hopefully that was a good amount of the questions. And thank you guys so much for watching. I'm delighted that Swordcatcher is now out in the world. I'm very excited to share this panoply of new characters with you, and I hope that you will love them as much as I do.